Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Manning Up on Real Estate podcast. This is your podcast for your local news, strategies, and interviews for the real estate market of Greater Vancouver. I'm your host, Cameron Manning, and in episode 4 today, we're going to be talking all about tenants from hell. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. This is one of the biggest reasons why people do not start investing in real estate is they don't want to deal with tenants. They're afraid to get a bad tenant in their property. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about a couple examples of tenants from hell that my team and I have dealt with, as well as 5 strategies that you can do to avoid getting a tenant from hell when you start investing in rental real estate. Before we dive into the topic today, I'd like to let you know that this episode is being brought to you by the Investors Performance Group. Investors Performance Group is the largest real estate meetup group in the Greater Vancouver area. We bring you the tips, strategies, and market insights in the ever-changing real estate market of Greater Vancouver once a month. If you'd like to come out to one of our monthly meetings, you can search for the Investors Performance Group on meetup.com or shoot me a DM on any of your social media channels that you like, and I'll make sure to send you the details. All right, so let's get started. Let's start talking about tenants. We're going to be talking today about a couple different examples of some tenants from hell that my team and I have dealt with, as well as, again, 5 screening tips to avoid tenants from hell. Now, at the end of the day, I always find people have 2 excuses as to why they don't want to get started investing in real estate. And it's either I don't have the capital or I don't want to deal with tenants, because I heard from a friend who's got an uncle who's invested in real estate that they had a tenant who destroyed the property. And well, there's a lot of stories out there like that, and it is definitely a reality. There are a lot of things that you can do to make sure that you avoid getting a tenant from hell. Don't let this fear stop you from putting away for your long-term wealth by avoiding investing in rental real estate. So let's get started. First tenant from hell I'm going to talk about is a tenant from hell that I actually had to deal with personally when I was doing a little bit of property management for some friends. This was a scenario where a client of Kelly's had bought a 4-plex down in the Surrey area. In that property, there was 4 units total. 3 were vacant and 2 were recently renovated. He was going to renovate the 3rd, and 1 had a tenant in place that they assumed. Now, when I first met the tenant, I was a little leery of them, but of course, they were already there. There was nothing to be dealt with. And of course, the very first time I went to collect rent, they didn't have the rent. So it took me 3 days to be able to get rent from them. They finally paid it up. Second month rolls around, and of course, these people have a ton of complaints as we're going along. They're just making it really annoying. I almost get daily phone calls. Oh, the contractors are too loud during the day, and I work from home. When really what they meant was I just stay at home the whole time because I knew that they were on assisted living. Now, these tenants ended up on month 2 not paying their rent on time again. So a couple days goes by. They're giving me all the excuses as to why they're not paying. So by day 3, I post a notice to evict on their door. Now, in British Columbia, it's a 10 days notice to evict, which means that the tenant either has 5 days to either pay the rent or they have to appeal it at the Residential Tenancy Board. After the 10 days, technically, they're supposed to be out. Now, that's never the case. Tenants never leave right on the 10 days. I don't think I've had a single scenario where they have left on day 10. So, of course, I serve the tenant, and I get no response. I'm knocking on the door. I'm doing everything I can. I finally have to post it on the door. Now, when you post it on the door, that means that technically now they get 13 days because it takes 3 days for it to be noticed, quote unquote, or acknowledged that the fact that it was delivered. And then, of course, it takes the 10 days from there. So in the meantime, I'm calling, I'm asking about the rent. I finally get a hold of the wife, and she doesn't even know about the eviction notice because the husband saw it on the door, tore it up, and hid it from her. And of course, she's still coming up with all these excuses that her husband's the one who's trying to hold back the rent. She's trying to make sure that it can get paid. They just need more time. And I said, listen, you've got from now until the 5 days are up to pay the rent. If not, I'm going to the next step. From there, I had to go to the Residential Tenancy Board and get an order of possession. Now, sometimes this can be a very long, drawn-out process. Other times, it can go very quick. I was very lucky in this scenario where I was able to get my order of possession and the notice for the hearing with the arbitrator within a week and a half. So when I went to go serve these tenants, sure enough, they were ignoring me. I could hear them inside the house. I'm knocking on the door to serve them the order of possession, all the evidence, as well as the date of the hearing, and they were just ignoring me. So because I knew they were home, I went down into the basement suite, and the contractor was still there. And well, he ended up having to turn off the power anyways. So I said, well, here, he said, every time I turn off the power, they come down to find out how long it's going to be out for. So why don't I turn off the power and you just wait here, and I'll do what I need to do with the electrical, and they'll come down knocking on the door. So sure enough, that's what happened. I waited in the unit. He turned off the electrical, started working on some circuits, and then they came down banging on the door. That's when I was able to serve them the order of possession. Now we went into the arbitrator time, and of course, this is when anytime you go to arbitration, you just really answer the questions as neutral as you can, keep it factual, and make sure that you just keep silent. Let the tenants do the work digging themselves into the hole. And that's exactly what happened. Now, leading up to that, I was very diligent in my paperwork. When there were starting to be problems, I was documenting every phone call I had with them, what was said, every text I printed, every email, everything, and I sent it as part of my evidence to the arbitrator. So that way, when the arbitrator was looking, he could see that I actively tried to work with them to be able to get the rent paid or find ways to make it work. But of course, they were not being willing. So when we came down to arbitration, I'm actually had to run out from a meeting, stepped in my car, made the call, answered the question, and then the rest of it was the tenant just blowing up. Well, they shut down the power. Well, there's been renovations on the other suites. Well, this, that, and the other. And he kept going into the fact that that has nothing to do with the current topic. The current topic is you not paying your rent. So sure enough, at the end of the day, the arbitrator voted for, on our side, granted the order of possession. When I went to serve it, they were already moving out, which was lucky. The arbitrator made them move out within a week, so it was a really fast turnaround. We were really lucky on this one. Of course, when I went to go serve him, he was very belligerent. He lifted up a hammer, threatened me with the hammer. Luckily, I had the contractor there just to keep an eye on things. End of the day, though, they did move out, but it was a bit of a process. And luckily, the order of possession is not that expensive of a process. It costs you about a $50 processing fee. It's when you have to take it to the next level. So hopefully, if you guys ever have a tenant that you have to evict from, guaranteed you're probably going to have to go to that point where you're doing the order of possession. Hopefully you don't have to go much more past that. So now we're going to be talking about another scenario which happened to a client of ours that we were working with. Now this guy was what we like to call a professional tenant. He knew the tenancy laws inside and out and knew how to manipulate them to his own advantage, especially for a client or a landlord who didn't really know what they were doing. Now, this client of ours was an elderly lady. She was in her 80s, and she had rented to this gentleman. Now, he was a large gentleman, and there was a lot behind the scenes before we got involved, trying to kind of help guide her and show her what she needs to do in terms of talking to the tenancy board and things like that. But when we got involved, she had already served him an eviction notice and already had the order of possession in her possession. So all of that was already done, and sure enough, this guy wasn't leaving. Now, his dispute was that when he moved in, the fridge wasn't working. Apparently, the fridge just needed to be plugged in, but he was a large gentleman with diabetes, and he couldn't move it, so he expected the landlord to do it, who's, again, a little old lady in her 80s. So this is why he wasn't paying his rent and all these things. Now, when we first got involved, it was a little bit of a crazy scenario. She calls us up, says, listen, I've got cops coming to take him out. I want you guys to get into the unit so you can see it, so we can list it. And, well, we did that. We went with her, met the police officers, went into the unit, and the guy wasn't home. He was letting a friend stay with him. And that guy started calling the tenant right away and saying, like, listen, these police are saying you have to leave. As we were going through the process, the police kind of find out that they actually don't have the jurisdiction to ask this guy to leave. She hasn't actually gone through the full process yet. Again, the order of possession doesn't mean that he actually has to leave. Bailiffs haven't been involved yet. It's only after bailiffs have been involved and removed him, if he's broken back into the property, that police can then get involved. So all of a sudden at that point, the police had to say, sorry, we got to step back. We can't do this anymore. You need to go and get the proper procedures. You need to get a bailiff involved first. So, of course, can be a very expensive process. Now, in the process, though, we did have an offer on the property, and our buyer was actually willing to pay for that process up to a certain amount. So she was pretty lucky at that time that we had that availability. Now, my client went to court to go get the writ of possession. Once that writ of possession was granted, it was granted pretty quickly and easily because all the evidence was there that he wasn't paying and he needed to go. She came back. We hired the bailiff. The bailiff arrived, knocked on the door. Sure enough, there was the tenant, and they served him the writ of possession, said, all right, we're going to start moving your stuff out. He counter-serves them with what was called an order to stay. So he actually went to the courts and actually convinced a judge to give him an order to stay for an extra 10 days. That superseded the writ of possession. Now, both myself, Kelly on my team, and even the bailiffs, they had never actually seen this happen before. Normally, once the bailiffs have the writ of possession in hand, that is it. There's no more for them to do. They are out. So this was a very shocking revelation. The bailiff said, listen, we can't evict him. This strictly says that he's allowed to stay. So sure enough, we have to look for those 10 days. We go to the courts. We verify it is indeed a legal document that he did do. And we're like, okay, we need to be prepared because now we need to get a second writ of possession and rehire the bailiffs the next time. But we bet that he's probably going to do something similar. So we actually kind of are in advance. We make sure that we have someone go to the courts with the client. And sure enough, he's there. He's there to try to get another order of stay. So we were able to get the client's lawyers on the phone. We were able to go into the court hearing when he was getting his order to stay. Now, at the time between the lawyers talking to the judge, and of course the tenant there, they did end up granting him a small order to stay, which was only for 5 days, basically saying you now have 5 days to pack up and get out, at which time the bailiffs will come and remove you. So we had a win on that one. And at that point, he says, well, this isn't over because I'm going to take this to the next level of court, which means that I'm going to get a court date 6 months from now. So you can't kick me out until after those 6 months. Now, during that time, he actually had it. Literally the next day was the hearing for that one. And in this case, we lucked out. And the judge at that point said, well, why am I hearing from this? The case is against you. You're not paying rent. They've already got a writ of possession. It's time for you to go. So bailiffs came and had him removed. But this is an example of someone who truly was what we call a professional tenant. They knew the laws inside out. He knew what kind of forms to go and get. He knew how to talk to the judges to get these orders of stays. This gentleman ended up living in that property for over 7 months without paying a dime. Now, that is the worst type of tenant that you can get. But there are ways, as we said, to avoid them. Now, the final example I'm going to give you is not necessarily a tenant that actually rented from a property, but it was an applicant for a tenant that Kelly had got, and she decided not to rent to them, and this is what caused all the stir. Now, Kelly and her partner Guy, they've been doing a lot of renovations on buildings. They've been turning it around and making beautiful new units in areas that need a revitalization. And of course, with that comes a lot of tenant applications because people love the new units that they're doing. Now, there was a lady and her daughter who wanted to rent 2 units, and it was one of the other daughters that was spearheading the mission because the one daughter was on some sort of a disability. I don't know all the details of it, and then the mother was a travel agent. But it was the one daughter that was spearheading getting both of the units for mother and sister. Now, she wanted to pay for 6 months upfront on rent for both of the units. So this was a little bit of a red flag. Now, the property manager at the time was actually kind of ecstatic because he's like, great, 6 months up front, I don't have to do work collecting rent, blah, blah, blah. But Kelly was a little leery of it. And she said, well, no, we still got to go through the whole process. I need credit reports, everything like that. And they supplied that. And of course, mom has terrible credit and the daughter on the disability has no credit, right? So from a credit standpoint, they don't check out, they don't pass the check. So she turns to the sister and says, well, listen, we're still open to this, but we need to see better credit. Are you willing to co-sign? The sister sends in an application without her SIN number and does not allow for the credit pull. Well, if you're a co-signer, they're going to need to see your credit. So at that point, Kelly says, you know what, I'm just really leery of this. The one sister who's spearheading this is not willing to give her credit, even though she's willing to co-sign. And they're talking about paying up front. That's kind of also a little sketchy. You know what, we're just going to turn this application down based on credit. Well, from there came the whole storm where Kelly and her partners got a long email from the manager that he got sent stating that they were discriminating against the sister because of her disability, and that's why they're not renting to her. So she's going to take her to BC Human Rights or BC Housing, Human Rights Councils, Human Rights Tribunals, Global TV, everything like that, because they are discriminating against a disabled person. And they had already engaged a lawyer to sue them for this as well. So Kelly and Guy were, of course, very, very nervous about this, and they decided to talk to their lawyer. Their lawyer did some digging, found out that, yes, they did talk to a lawyer, but no, he's not been retained. So the lawyer ended up drafting a very long email saying exactly why they were being denied and what ramifications they're going to deal with if they decide to pursue this. Ends up that, of course, it was dropped. But this is another example of a situation where something was not lining up quite right. If they would have rented to them, they potentially could have gotten another tenant from hell. Luckily, Kelly follows these different principles on screening her tenants to make sure that she only puts the top tenants in her properties. So those are a few just interesting scenarios that we've dealt with, and most of these have actually been in the last year or so as well. But regardless, if you are getting into rental real estate, you're going to be dealing with a whole bunch of different types of tenants. And at the end of the day, there are some amazing tenants out there. You just need to make sure that, one, your marketing is trying to attract those tenants, and two, your screening process weeds out the ones that are not good. And we're going to talk quickly about that on the 5 methods that you can use, or 5 different screening processes you can use to make sure you weed out tenants from hell. Now, this is an article that I wrote both on my LinkedIn and over on Medium. So if you are not connected with me there, go and check it out. Gives you a little bit more details, and you can actually print it out and keep it next to you. But I've also talked briefly on my YouTube channel last year on this topic, but I thought it's a good idea to bring it back up because I have heard a lot of people talking about why they don't want to be landlords. So let's dive into this. The 5 screening tips that you can use to avoid a tenant from hell. So the first tip here is, number 1, have an application. At the end of the day, a lot of people will just say, give me your name, number, and some information about you, and they make their decision based on that. At the end of the day, if you even own just one rental property, or if you live in a property that has a suite in the basement, this is now your business, and you need to treat it like a business. So having a formal application is one of the number 1 things you can start with to start weeding out tenants from there. Now, what kind of information should you have on this application? Well, first and foremost, you need information about them. So that includes name, phone number, email, current address, previous address, social insurance number, if they have any pets. Now, a couple things I said in there. Oh, date of birth as well. A couple things I said in there, especially the social insurance number. There's 2 reasons why you want the social insurance number. 1, so you can do a credit check, and it's going to be a more accurate credit check. And 2, if anything ever happens and you need to go after them, that's the only way you can really hunt them down, is with the social insurance number, because they can change their phone numbers, they can change their addresses, they can change their emails, but you can't change your social insurance number. Also on that application, you're going to want to have a spot for their employer's information. So who are they employed by? What are their phone numbers, emails, address? What is their current salary? Are they hourly or is it a salary? And how much do they earn per month and per year? That way, again, you're trying to determine if these people are employed and can pay your rent. Also on that, you're going to want a reference, especially if you're dealing with younger people, in the early 20s. Sometimes it's definitely good to have that quote unquote emergency contact, a mother, father, aunt, uncle, someone that you can call if there's ever an emergency. But not only that, sometimes you can use that as a way to kind of say, hey, FYI, your son, daughter, or whoever hasn't been paying her rent. Maybe you want to talk to them. But again, having that emergency contact is a great way. And then finally on that, you're going to have landlord reference checks. Now, I always ask for on my application for 2 reference checks if you can. Current landlord that they're currently renting from, and the most recent previous one. So that way you can get 2 different viewpoints on who these people are. We're going to dive a little bit more into that after. So now that you have a full application in hand, it's now time to move on. Now, there's a number of things you can do that are free before you go into some screening stuff that you actually have to pay for. But first and foremost, with that application, if even one thing is not filled out correctly, I do not process that application. I will call that tenant back and give them the opportunity to complete it properly. But if they buck at it, then they no longer are part of the application process. The biggest one that most people will not give you is their social insurance number. And I just flat out say, if I don't have a social insurance number, I will not rent the property to you. All right, so the next part, tip number 2 is to do the employment check. Based on that application, you now have their employer's information. So what are you going to do with that information? Call them and verify that they are working there, they are who they say they are, and they are making the money that they claim they're earning. I have had a scenario where someone put an employer down, said he was making over $100,000, and then found out that he was actually some guy who was on the kind of more minimum, not minimum wage, but on the lower pay scale, making about $50,000 a year. So he grossly overestimated or over evaluated how much he's earning, because I think he was trying to impress, saying I can afford this, when really he was borderline able to afford the property. So again, this is a big indicator for me, because if their income is not at the level that can afford your rent, what's the first thing they're going to stop paying? That's your rent. So make sure that when you're verifying, I like to use, as a general guideline, because this is what the banks use to give you a mortgage, I like to use about a 30%. 30% of the income should be able to cover, 30% of the rent total should be 30% of their annual income. Sorry about that. But so the method I use is similar to what the banks use, and it's just a rough guideline, but I like to see that about the rent should only make up about 30 to 35% of their annual income. And that's the reason, is because we don't want these people to be house broke. They're going to have other bills. A lot of tenants will have car payments, cell phones, credit cards, everything like that. And at the end of the day, if they are paying more than 50, 60, 70% into their rent, that doesn't leave them enough to live off of. So again, what's the first thing that's going to get cut? It's paying the rent, or they'll be late consistently. All right, tip number 3 is getting your landlord reference checks done. Now, I indicated earlier in my application process that I collect 2 references. First is their current landlord, because I want to talk to the current landlord and find out how they are as a tenant. Now, the reason why I want the second one, though, is because if they are a tenant from hell, or they are a tenant that you might not want to rent from, the current landlord might not be 100% truthful, because at the end of the day, he's trying to offload his headache onto somebody else. So sometimes you might get a glowing review. Other times they might be honest, which is great. Having that second landlord is always the best method if you can, because at the end of the day, they have no ties to these people. They've already left their property. So the likelihood is they're going to be a little more honest and let you know, oh, this was the issues we had with their dogs. This is the issue we had with collecting rent. We had several noise complaints from neighbors. Or they paid on time, their dogs are well behaved, and these people are quiet and never caused any issues. Those are the types of things you're looking for, and the second landlord, we always find, is a little bit more forthcoming than the current landlord. Again, they don't have any strings attached to these people anymore, versus someone maybe trying to get rid of them. So having those questions is very key. I have several different questions. I have a list. So I'm asking, are they current on their current rent? Are there any issues that you might know of? And in fact, I also verify the rent they're paying, because you never know. Tenants can lie sometimes on an application, and I'll change up the amount that the tenant has claimed they're paying by $50 to $100. 2 things. One, because I want to verify that this is the actual landlord, and the landlord will know most likely what they're getting paid in rent. So if I have, maybe the tenant has given a friend to be the landlord, quote unquote, he'll just agree and say, yeah, totally, that's what they're paying. Whereas a landlord would say, well, no, they're actually paying $1,400 versus $1,500, whatever the case might be. That's how you know you're talking to the landlord. I also ask how many times they've been behind on their rents. I ask if there's been any noise complaints from other neighbors, anything like that. It's about a 10 question to 12 question process, and a lot of times I try to keep it to a yes or no as much as I can. I give some time at the very end to say, is there anything else you need to tell me about the tenant? That way they can elaborate a little bit more. Okay, so now that we've gone through getting the application, we've done the employment check, and we've done the landlord reference check, now it's time to spend a little money. And I know that's the last thing people want to hear. I got to spend money to get a tenant. Aren't they supposed to be paying me? But here's the deal. You want a good tenant that's going to stay a long time and pay you rent consistently, you got to spend a little money, and it's not a lot. That's doing a credit check. Now, I'm a big fan of doing the credit check myself. I don't necessarily like being handed a credit check. The reason for that is because then I can verify I'm the one who pulled the credit and I know where it came from. So why credit checks then? Why take that process to go through a credit check, cost yourself money? Well, at the end of the day, out of everything that we've gone through, both the application, the employer checks, and the landlord checks, a credit check is the only thing that will not lie to you. And at the end of the day, too, it kind of tells a tale. Sometimes it's a very good tale where you're excited and you see that they're paying their bills on time, they've got excellent credit, or sometimes it tells you a very devastating tale where they're behind on payments on a truck, credit cards, this, that, and the other, and their credit is like a D rating in the 400s or something like that. So at the end of the day, having that credit check is going to actually tell you a lot about their character. So very important, make sure you get a credit check. Now, where do you get credit checks? Well, it's pretty simple. If you're a landlord, you can set up an account with tenantverification.com. That is the system I use. The reason why I like tenantverification.com, and now this is not an advertisement for tenant verification. I like their program. I like what they offer. But the reason why I like it is because it's not a membership or anything like that. It's pay per pull. So I'm not paying monthly because at the end of the day, I'm not processing it. I've right now, it's been over 9 months since I've processed an application because I've had tenants now for over 9 months in all my units. But if you're paying a monthly subscription, maybe it's a good idea for those ones if you're having constant turnover and you've got a large portfolio and you do the management yourself, or if you're hooking it up to your property manager to have access to. In my opinion, the pay per pull is the best option because, again, you're only paying when you pull the credit. Now, with tenantverification.com, don't quote me on this, but I believe it's about $22 with tax that I pay for my account to be able to pull a credit. And of course, if you have a husband and wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, or 2 applicants on a unit, you are going to be paying for 2 credit pulls. Because again, my applications allow for a secondary applicant on them with all their information. So it's going to cost you about $44. Again, $44 is not a lot of money to have peace of mind when you actually pull that credit. Now, at the end of the day, what am I looking for in the credit? Again, I'm looking at the current credit score. You know, I have taken people with credit scores that are in the lower 600s into the high 500s, as long as they've shown that everything's been paid on time, everything's on track, as well as if maybe they've got a story, maybe they've gone through a divorce, it hurt their credit, but they're rebuilding. You know, I will take sometimes those scenarios, but credits I will not take is anything less than the 600 mark, where I also see that everything is either an I2, R2, which means either it's an installment payment that's behind by 1 or 2 months, revolving payments that are behind 1 or 2 months, because it's showing that these guys are not consistent on their paying. So that could be the same scenario when they go to pay their rent. Don't skimp out on the credit report, guys. This is one of the biggest things that I can tell you. It is probably what's going to weed out most of your clients or most of your bad tenants, is getting that credit report. Now, again, all this said and done, sometimes you might just have a feeling about somebody. And this is where tip number 5 comes in. And I can give you a story where I didn't follow this tip and I ended up with a tenant that caused damage and moved out and didn't pay rent. That is the final gut check. Now, if you are for whatever reason feeling absolutely uncomfortable with this tenant, there's just something not sitting right with you, but their employments came back, the landlords came back, and even their credit's not bad. If you're still not feeling right about it, maybe it's not the right tenant fit for you. You don't ever want to put a tenant in that you feel leery about, and sure enough, that person ends up living up to that expectation. Now, I had a scenario that I can give you another quick example of where I did not follow the gut check. This was in my early career starting out in real estate as an investor, and we were doing a rent to own on a property, and both my mother, who was my partner at the time, and the mortgage broker qualifying was really keen on wanting to help this young woman out. But I had this gut feeling about her. I didn't know what it was, but I just didn't feel right. But unfortunately, I caved to the peer pressure of both my mortgage broker and my mother at the time, who was my partner, pushing me to take the tenant. So I took the tenant, and we had non-stop problems for 3 years with this tenant. Now, we couldn't necessarily evict her because we were trying to help her out with this rent to own. But it was scenarios like being fined from it wasn't a trailer park that we invested in, so fined from the park because she wasn't mowing the lawn. Then she had a boyfriend over that ripped out the railings, and then she was behind on rent because she hasn't been to work for a while. All these different scenarios that kept happening, and finally, when it came down to it, she was late on rent. We were trying to collect it. She sent a text saying, "I'm not paying rent. I'm moving out today. Don't try to contact me again." And we went to the property, and there was holes in the wall galore. I spent $5,000 just trying to clean the place back up, just to make it livable again, without all the holes. And unfortunately, the way the trailer park is not normal drywall. You have to do it per panel. You can't just do a patch. So it was a decent chunk of change that we had to spend to clean that place back up. Needless to say, I now follow my gut. If I have a weird suspicion about somebody, I will take that to heart and maybe say this isn't the right applicant for me because I just don't feel right about them. So those are 5 ways that you can help avoid a tenant from hell. Again, these are not bulletproof. Sometimes people can slip through the cracks, but tip number 1 is to have an application. Tip 2, employment check, then do the landlord references, credit checks, and finally your gut check. But by employing these, you will help weed out more of the bad tenants than you will actually gain in tenants that actually make it through and go into the properties and do damage. Very important, though, you take this seriously. This is your investment, so you need to make sure you protect it and put only tenants in place that is going to care for it like you would. Ladies and gentlemen, that is it from me. I hope you guys enjoyed this segment of Manning Up on Real Estate. Again, if you guys have any questions, you guys can reach out to me on the Anchor app. That is the app that I use here to record this podcast. And you can actually leave me a voicemail that I can play on future podcasts and answer your questions live. Also, if you're on Instagram or Twitter, make sure you hit me up. I'm Cam E. Manning on Instagram and Cameron E. Manning on Twitter. And you can use the hashtag ManningUpRE to ask me any questions that you may have in regards to investing in real estate, if you're a realtor looking to increase your marketing, anything like that. Don't forget, you can follow me on all the different social media channels. I'm on everywhere, so we can connect and I can help you out with your investing goals. And not only that, go to youtube.com/Cameron Manning for more tips, tricks, and videos on investing. That's it from me, guys. Thank you so much for listening in today, and I hope you guys have a wonderful next 2 weeks.